Hi, this is David Boje, and I'm here to tell you a story of spiritual leadership in a community called Nickerson Gardens in South Central LA in an area called Watts. It's Bridging Worlds, a leadership model for community transformation. That's the topic. It's a synthetic spiritual leadership approach. The problem is there were competing visions for Nickerson Gardens, the largest public housing community west of the Mississippi. Over 5,000 people live there, and 1,050 units of public housing. It's a mother's community, single-family mothers. The fathers of the household, most of them, 90%, are in prison in the United States because of the justice system imprisoning African Americans. Look it up. There were two competing visions. One, to grow the community. That was Nora King. I was a pro bono consultant brought in to work with the community. I had to audition, even to do free consulting. And Nora King became my mentor and taught me most of what I learned about spiritual consulting and consulting in general. The other vision was Pam Griffin. She was a Democrat, sponsored by Maxine Waters mainly, to get rid of public housing and move people out of it and into suburban communities all throughout Los Angeles and San Fernando Valley. So these two competing visions were happening. When I went to be a consultant for Nora King, I had to explain that why I had credentials to work in the community, since I was obviously not from the community. And it quickly became clear to me that I wasn't going to be able to obtain that job as a consultant for free if I didn't get into my personal story. So I explained that I had grown up on welfare, that my mother was a single family parent whose father, my father, well, her husband, right, left her, abandoned her. She came home, and I grew up in high school on welfare. My little brothers and my little sister were stereotyped, even though, they hadn't grown up that way. So when I told them that I had been on welfare and I had worked in the fields at age 14 at Krause Nursery and given the money to my parents, things softened and I was embraced and invited in. My job, many of them, will create a tutoring program. I brought students from Loyola Marymount down a couple days a week, and we did tutoring to the children. Then she said, hey, there's a Peace Corps grant, and that grant could be a great opportunity for the community. Can you go write a grant? And I'd been writing grants for Vice Chancellor C.Z. Wilson at UCLA for 6 years there, and I'd done some at Loyola Marymount. So I said, sure, I'll write a grant. I wrote a grant, and I interviewed everybody in the community I could, all the women leaders of the Resident Management Council. It's a Jack Kemp initiative. He's a Republican, but he had a vision for growing community, creating economic opportunities in the community. And so I framed it that way. And it would have a jobs program where we would train people to be working in public bureaucracies of the city of Los Angeles, including public housing, as clerks and as maintenance people. They balked at it. The city balked at the whole idea of this program. And their lawyer kept lying to us, saying, oh, yeah, we could do that program, like I said last week. Well, the last week, he didn't seem to remember the next week, so we started to tape record him. And as soon as he said, oh yeah, I never agreed to having residents go into training to have jobs in the city, we produced the tape and played his own voice back to him. So that's the kind of things we had to do as activists. And it came to pass that the Peace Corps grant was funded by the Peace Corps, and the city of LA went into celebration. Mayor Tom Bradley brought everybody to City Hall from the Peace Corps, Washington, D.C. Peace Corps, etc., and city council people. And they took the stage and they claimed that they had brought the Peace Corps initiative to Los Angeles public housing. They introduced me on stage right at the end before they broke for refreshments in the hall. And I said, wait a minute, that's not the way it happened. The people of Nickerson Gardens produced that grant. I wrote it, but I didn't create it. Nora King created it. She was the president and is president of the Residence Management Council. And I think it would be in order to invite her on stage and explain who really created this grant for the Peace Corps to come to Los Angeles. 12 people from the Peace Corps to come to Nickerson Gardens and do economic development instead of being teachers. So Nora came from the back of the room, walked up to the stage, stood on the middle of the stage, took the microphone, and presented the best presentation I ever heard in my life. Her voice was booming. It was spiritual. She gave gratitude to Jesus, to answers to prayer for the Peace Corps. She thanked me, which I greatly appreciated. And she said, look, the true story here is it wasn't the people from the Peace Corps. It wasn't the people from the city, certainly not from the Housing Authority. We, at the Residence Management Council, a group of mothers taking care of their children and community, asked Professor Boje to write the grant. That's the true story. Well, it was never reported in the news media that way, and I wanted to bring this story to light. A couple of other points I want to make here is when we graduated the first 7 residents to take those jobs in the city public housing, they used my cap and gown. We had one cap and gown. The whole thing was the Public Housing Authority wouldn't fund any of the training, so I got volunteers from Loyola Marymount University and people from the community, and we did like in-basket training, giving scenarios to about 50 residents, and we chose 7. The next year, there were 40 residents that took jobs. Never anybody late, never missed a day of work, never had a single complaint, because that was the deal. If they had a complaint, they were out. Now, Nora King lost the election the next year. Maxine Waters funded Pam Griffin, and I'll show you a picture of her. We're standing in front of a memorial to the people at Nickerson Garden, the children, all children who had been killed in drive-by shooting outside the community. And this has 300 or more names. I used to jog in the community when I went there several days a week from my job at Loyola Marymount. And you can see sometimes I dressed as a clown. I helped people come into this is on Halloween. We were going to go into the tutoring, do a little parade around the community. I want to say that this spiritual leadership presentation mixes my own Christianity background, reading the Bible for passages to help implement this in Nickerson Gardens, because people wanted to know in a spiritual community, hey, what's the biblical reference to you saying we can do strategic planning, to you saying we can do leadership on our own? And I said, well, it's inspired by the Bible, and I would quote passages, and I would prepare these passages, and that's how we work together. You don't go into a spiritual community and start spouting your academic theories. Now, the other thing to recognize here is after I met my second wife, and I went off on a more upward spiral, Grace Ann Roselle. I'd been on a downward spiral on my first marriage, so a divorce and bankruptcy, which is really embarrassing to be a business professor and be bankrupt. But this community of Nickerson Gardens brought me on an upward spiral. And when I married my second wife, still working with the community, Grace Ann Roselle, she introduced me to Gurudev Shikshabhanaji and Pramodabhin. Gurudev, a Jain monk from India, walked with Gandhi, first to come on an airplane, leave India, come to New York, give up being a monk, get married to Pramodabhin, all of those wonderful things. That was inspiring to me to mix the Jainism blended together with the Christianity. I know people don't normally do that, but I developed my own model of what would be an amazing approach to pro bono consulting. And I attempted to bring together what I call the 7 chakra energies: your root chakra, sacral, solar plexus, heart, throat, third eye, crown chakra. You're all familiar with that. Many different disciplines do that, but in Jainism, it has special Sanskrit words, which I'll skip for now. And I was tying it into my theory of the story seeds of leading and consulting in a community. And I'm working this week to talk to you about the between, having those between relationships when you switch political parties and where you're working and you're the consultant. What do? Do you just leave, or do you do the consulting? So when Nora King wasn't elected, a Republican, and Pam Griffin was Democrat, and the Democrat initiative was, hey, let's get rid of public housing, just move everybody to the suburbs. And Nora's approach was build the community, economic development, because our cousins and our brothers and our sisters, our children were born there. It's a community. Let's make it work. So Jack Kemp had that kind of initiative in a Republican administration. So I had to maintain consulting with both. And the with part of it, as part of the 7 W's, and we're dealing with the relationships that you attract into your life. So that's basically the story I wanted to tell you. And now you'll see kind of a film that Notebook LM does. I put in my script. They do the graphics, which are wonderful, and I appreciate them. And I hope this gives you some insight into spiritual leadership, spiritual consulting in a divided community of mothers taking care of their children. Thank you.
Okay, so today we're jumping into this incredible story of leadership and trust that all went down in Watts, Los Angeles. It's all about this unlikely team-up between a university professor, a group of really determined women, and some ancient spiritual ideas, all coming together to challenge the system and totally rewrite their own story. Let's dive in. So right at the heart of this whole thing was this huge clash of ideas about the future of the Nickerson Gardens housing project. And it really boiled down to 2 completely different ways of looking at the American dream. You can think of it as the gardener versus the travel agent. All right, so on one side, you had what we're calling the travel agent approach. And the whole idea here was that the only way to get empowered was to get out. The goal was to give people things like job training, help with their resumes, basically give them a ticket to a supposedly better life somewhere else, out in the suburbs. But then you have Nora King, a real pillar of the community, and she had a totally different take on it, the gardener approach. She believed that real power didn't come from leaving. It came from cultivating the community right where it was. It wasn't about packing bags, it was about planting roots, building businesses, and actually owning a piece of Nickerson Gardens. And you gotta understand, this wasn't just some theoretical debate happening in an office somewhere. This was a battle for the very soul of a community, happening inside the bright yellow walls of Nickerson Gardens. The question was pretty simple, but so profound. Do you fix a place by encouraging everyone to leave it, or do you fix it by digging in and really tending the soil? So into this already tense situation walks this complete outsider, Professor David Boje, a university guy, full of academic theories, who shows up on a Harley-Davidson wanting to help. But he was about to get a huge reality check. And man, Nora King was not having it. She hit him with this powerful skepticism right away. She didn't care about his degrees or his awards. She basically looked him in the eye and said, "What could a professor like you possibly know about our lives, our struggles, all that stuff that works in the academic world? It means nothing here." So what does Boje do? Does he pull out a textbook to defend himself? Nope. He tells her his true story. He just drops the whole professor act and tells her about his own past, growing up on welfare, working in the fields. And here's the kicker, the part that changed everything, his present. At that exact moment, his own life was falling apart. He was bankrupt, going through a divorce, and he was actually homeless, couch surfing right there in her community. I mean, that was it. That was the moment. That level of raw vulnerability just blew up the wall between them. It stopped being about the expert and the activist. It became about two people who understood struggle. Trust wasn't earned with a fancy resume. It was built with a true story. Okay, so now that they actually trust each other, Boje can finally bring his ideas to the table. But he's smart enough to know that a bunch of academic jargon is just going to fall flat. So instead, he explains his whole framework using this really powerful and simple analogy, a spiritual radio receiver. First things first, he says, you have to recognize all the static, and he gives it a name from Jain philosophy, Ashrava. This is all the negative junk flooding the community, the media stereotypes, the bureaucratic nonsense, the political games. It's just this constant, chaotic noise that's drowning everything else out. So, how do you deal with all that noise? Well, you need a tuner, right? Boje introduces this idea of Anna, which is like a third eye of inner wisdom. For the women of Nickerson Gardens, this was about consciously filtering out all that negativity and deliberately choosing to tune into their own strength, their own faith. And what's the whole point of this? It's so the Atma, the real soul of the community, can finally get a clear signal. Once you filter out all that static, the women could finally hear their own powerful message, loud and clear. They weren't victims. They were leaders. They were entrepreneurs. And this is just a brilliant example of him actually doing it, of tuning that radio. He knew the women on the council were deeply religious, so when they kind of pushed back on the term strategic planning, he didn't whip out some business school textbook. He just tuned to their frequency. He showed them how planning was all over the Bible. Nehemiah had a plan to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and Joseph had a plan to manage grain during a famine. It just clicked. And you know what? This crazy mix of vulnerability, spiritual ideas, and biblical wisdom, it actually worked. They completely changed the story of their community, from one of victims to one of entrepreneurs. They even landed this groundbreaking Peace Corps grant, the first one ever given for a project like this. But the fight was far from over. So they get to the big celebration at City Hall. And what happens? The mayor, Tom Bradley, and all these other officials get up on stage and basically present the whole thing as their idea, their achievement. And Nora King, the woman who made it all happen, she's not even on the stage. She's just sitting in the audience like a spectator. So the mayor calls Professor Boje up to the stage, probably expecting him to just smile and say thank you. But that is not what happened. Boje gets up there, and he publicly sets the record straight. He tells everyone that this wasn't the city's doing, it was Nora King's leadership. And he basically refused to move until they brought her up on stage with him. So Nora King walks up to that podium and just takes complete command. She thanks her community, she thanks Jesus for answering her prayers, and then she looks right at the officials and tells them, and the whole room, the truth. She powerfully reclaimed their story, their victory, right then and there. And right there, in that one single moment at City Hall, the real story won out over the official one. The credit went exactly where it belonged, to the women who had prayed and planned and fought so hard for their community's future. So this raises a really interesting question. What was Professor Boje's real role here? He clearly wasn't the hero who swooped in to save the day. He eventually figured out that the answer was kind of hidden in his own last name, Boje, which is the Danish word for a buoy.
I mean, just think about a buoy for a second. It doesn't steer the ship. It doesn't chase after it. It's just this stable, anchored, visible marker that helps other people find their way through rough water. Boje realized Nora King was the captain of the ship. His job was just to be the buoy.
And this, for me, is the most powerful part of the whole story. The things that absolutely broke him, the bankruptcy, the divorce, the homelessness, that's what became his anchor. That personal downward spiral is exactly what grounded him in their reality, what allowed him to be this stable presence for them without ever trying to take the wheel. His vulnerability truly became his strength. And that's what this whole story really leaves us with, right? This big question. We usually think leaders are the captains, the ones at the helm, steering the ship. But maybe, just maybe, true leadership and real service is something else entirely. Maybe it's about being the buoy, being the steady anchor presence that gives a community the confidence to navigate its own way forward.